Wonderful. So it's a real pleasure to have Jacob, who's going to speak to us now on science and faith. Jacob is our intern this year at the Parish Church. He's a wonderful young man, and he's exploring a sense of God's call to ministry. And it's been great to have the opportunity to sort of play a part in training and developing Jacob as a young leader. So Jacob, you're very welcome. We're a very friendly bunch, and obviously any really difficult questions we'll throw to Will or Keith or one of the many very intelligent people here to help you out. So anyway, go for it. Over to you, Jacob.
Thank you. Definitely an encouraging welcome. Good morning, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your breakfast. As Danny said, most of you probably know me. For those of you that don't, I am the intern here at Buckingham Parish Church, hopefully training for ministry. It's still been less than a year ago since I became a Christian, so I am young in faith. And I was so stuck on the whole science versus God issue, which is why I've often felt compelled to talk about it with many people. And it's something that I think people have so many questions about this subject, and more often than not, if there is one question that bothers you, it can be a massive barrier and boundary in your faith. You can just get really caught upon one thing. So I'm just going to do a short talk, and at the end a Q&A session. So which is why you have the handouts, and hopefully you remember to bring your pen to the front and just jot some questions down on the back if you have them. I really want to avoid that awkward situation where it gets to 10 minutes Q&A session and no one has any questions. That's the one thing I really want to avoid, so please fire away. I've already told, where is he, Peter Williams, I've already told him that he's not allowed to ask any questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'm going to forward you on to the expert Danny Rogers, I'm afraid. But hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions. On what's on the handouts is mostly content I'm not going to be covering, purely because I just don't have time. It's just if you find it interesting and you want to find out more, you can head over to the website, which is written at the top. That's my website, and hopefully find out more information there. Christianity is nearly 2,000 years old. Judaism is over 3,500 years old. And it would seem that recently we have what appears to be a developing epidemic, a catchphrase or a motto even, that has convinced and continues to convince so many people in the Western world that we can turn our back on God. All of a sudden, it would seem that science has buried God. God doesn't exist. Science has buried God. The Big Bang disproves God. You've more than likely heard such claims. In fact, you're probably hearing them more and more often. And this debate is so close to my heart because, as a fairly young person, when I go out and I'm speaking to people and talking to people, wherever it may be, this is the general consensus that everyone seems to have believed. And I'm here today not to argue that religion is more plausible than science. In fact, I would think that to be impossible. And the reason for that is I don't think there's any good reason to think that there's a clash between the two. I'm a big believer in science, especially physics, and equally I'm a big believer in Jesus. And the reason that is I think they answer a different set of questions. If I want to know how the universe was made, that's easy. I can ask a scientist. Same if I want to know what the universe is physically made of, or when even the universe came into being. But here I still don't have everything that I need, because I don't know who made it, and I don't know why it was made. Science tells us how and when, but faith tells us who and why. And I'm going to have to give Nicky Gumbel credit for that line. I stole that from Alpha. And he also used another demonstration in Alpha, which really stuck with me. He said, imagine if I had a cake, and I took the cake to a scientist. That scientist could tell me what it's made of, how it was made. He might even be able to tell me when it was made, but only I, as the creator of the cake, could tell him who made it. Only I could tell him I made that cake, and why it was made. My point is, we can't have all the answers with just science, and we can't have all the answers with just faith. But with good knowledge of both, we can answer almost all questions. I know atheists who say, there is no God. God is not real. God does not exist. And I'm like, wow, that's quite a bold statement of faith, is it not? I say to them, believing in something that profound, I'm expecting some pretty good evidence to back that claim. You can't honestly just expect me to believe in something like that. They're like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? I'm no man of faith. Well, sure they are. They believe that the universe happened by coincidence. They believe that this perfectly designed earth has no creator, and they believe that there is no God. That's a statement of faith. It's something they don't have any proof or evidence for. It's blind faith. And I like saying that to people so you can really turn the tables on them. But I don't like blind faith. I like reasonable faith. I found that when I was first looking into the subject, I have to stand in the middle and be neutral. And on one side, I have the belief of theism, that there is a God. And on the other side, the belief of atheism. And I consider that I have to assess and analyze the evidence and see which seems to be the more plausible option. You have to look at both and see which makes more sense. And what I learned was there is a small, logical, a rational step towards theism as opposed to a massive, blind leap of faith towards atheism. It seems like an obvious choice to me. Claiming atheism is a huge step of faith. When it comes to theism, the belief in God, we have an abundance of evidence. And I'll go through some of that evidence today, but there's so much, and I'd need hours to go through it all. I'm sure that most of us will be falling asleep by the end. But we have all sorts of academic arguments, fine-tuning argument, multiple cosmological arguments, morality arguments, historical evidence. But I find that among all this, the ultimate way of knowing that God is real is because you can know him personally. Once you encounter this, I tell you, it's much, much more difficult to convince a Christian that God isn't real. It's not an argument or evidence per se, but it's a way of knowing Christ to be true outside of these things. I do want to tackle some of the big topics, like what about the Big Bang? Surely we know now that God did not make the universe, the Big Bang did, obviously. So we now know, due to fairly recent scientific discoveries, that the universe is not timeless like many used to think it was. No, it indeed does have a beginning. Who saw that coming? I have the Bible here. I'm just going to flick to the beginning. Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Scientists trying to tell us that the beginning of the universe was some massive, monumental discovery. Genesis told us this 3,500 years ago. But I think six-day creationism is the real problem that so many people have. And people my age just seem to have it stamped into their brain. The Big Bang happened, so God can't be real. Our universe is around 13 billion years old, and our Earth is around 6 billion years old. So the universe and the Earth were not created within a 6-day period. I would start by saying that many scholars believe Genesis to be written as poetry. It shows that the creation of the universe was a process. Adam and Eve can be seen to be figures that represent humanity. Eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge was a representation of humanity sinning against God. Now, when I heard this information, I was still pretty skeptical and thought it all seemed a little wishy-washy. I was still am quite a stubborn person. I wasn't really satisfied with that information. So I thought, well, okay, then let's take a look at it literally and assume that it's not all poetry. 7 days, or rather 6 days and a rest day. What does this mean? When the writer of Genesis says day, is he talking about the 24-hour time period it takes for the earth to fully rotate? To understand this, we have to look at the Hebrew, which is the original language that Genesis was written in, where the word for day is yom. Yom means a day, or it can mean a period of time. You know when you say to someone, I'll be back in a minute, does this mean the other person is checking their watch, waiting for 60 seconds to pass before you return? No, when we say we'll be back in a minute, it means we will be back in an unspecified short period of time. Same when you say, I'm just popping out, I'll be back in a sec. We are not talking about a 1 second period of time. And in the same way, Hebrew yom it's an age, it's a period, an unspecified period of time. So now in the story of creation, if we replace day with age, it actually can all make pretty good sense. First, there's light, and then there's the water separating from the earth, which can seem to be gravity, ending up with humanity. The 6-day creationism is a fairly accurate representation of the evolution of the universe if you do want to look at it literally. But I just don't think there is any good reason to let the writings of early Genesis get in the way of my faith and my relationship with Jesus. In fact, one of the arguments, which will be on your sheet, the cosmological argument, one of the cosmological arguments actually uses the Big Bang as an argument for the evidence of God's existence. Now, I don't have time to go through all the arguments for the existence of God, but there is one which I do really want to mention, which is the teleological argument. I believe is at the top of your handouts. And this, for me, is absolute, undeniable evidence. So I'll go over it briefly. There are 100-ish constants in the universe which we rely on to make possible the existence of life. These 100-ish constants include factors like gravity, the size of the electric charge of an electron, the ratio of masses of the proton and the electron, all sorts of things. But the point is, we rely on these factors for life to be possible, or for life to even exist. If any of the values of these factors were even the slightest, tiniest bit different, life in the universe would cease to exist. Gravity, for example, if the absolute strength of gravity were even the tiniest bit stronger upon the beginning of the universe would have failed to expand or would have imploded in on itself. Equally, if gravity were the tiniest bit weaker, the universe would have overexpanded in a way that no planets or stars could have been formed. But what does this mean? This means that the universe appears to have been very finely tuned and designed. Even Stephen Hawking himself confessed, quote, "The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." And there's three possible options as to how this may have taken place. Number one being physical necessity, which means that the numbers must be set to these values and it's impossible for them to be otherwise. But it's just not the case. So these values have been the same since the dawn of time. They've not changed. They exist outside of evolution. And it's more than possible for the numbers to have landed on any length of different combinations that would mean that life could not exist. The second option is chance and hardly likely. If the gravitational constant varies just 1 in 10 to 60 parts, none of us would exist. That's 1 in 10 with another 60 zeros at the end. And that's just one of the 100 constants. Putting this down to chance would not be very intellectually honest. And that leaves us the final option, number 3, that the universe was designed to be that way. Now, this is just one of many good and solid arguments we have for believing in the existence of God. And when I was studying all of this as a non-Christian, I made a special effort to see what the atheist had to say about the situation. Richard Dawkins is considered to be one of the leading atheists in the world at the moment, or some people call him the greatest atheist of our time. So I bought his book on the subject. I bought the God's Delusion. Now, some of the strongest arguments that we have, he doesn't even address. I think it to be the cosmological argument would pop up around pages 64 or 65 of the God Delusion. They're not even there. They're missing. He addresses some very old version of some Thomas Aquinas theories, but doesn't even bother mentioning some of our recent arguments. But luckily for us, he does actually address this argument. And he believes in some sort of multiverse, which is like an infinite universe generator that just pops out universes one after another, and eventually every now and then universes will pop out while life is possible. And that obviously would be his response to the teleological argument. But the problem with the multiverse is it's not measurable, it's not observable, nor is it provable. So the fact that he believes in such a thing with such little evidence is ironic, considering that his leading argument is that we don't have sufficient evidence for believing in God. And even if by some chance the multiverse does turn out to be true, we then have the ontological argument, which is then valid, which proves the existence of God on a basis that there are infinite universes. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because it's important to know that there is no quarrel between science and God. The quarrel is between theism and atheism. In fact, in light of all the arguments we have, the quarrel would seem to be science and faith versus atheism. I have yet to read just one decent reason for believing that atheism is true. Atheists seem to try and poke holes in our faith or look profusely for biblical contradictions. There's no good or active reason to back atheism. When I did my first Alpha course, I spoke to someone named Chris who did a lot of the wonderful cooking there, and he said this to me: "All head, no heart, you dry up. All heart, no head, you blow up." And that really stuck with me. I like that. And I realized that I could not have a faith on academics alone. And it wasn't until I opened my heart up to God and opened myself up spiritually to God that everything changed. I went from being a very dry academic to having actually a relationship with Jesus. And even aside from scientific evidence, we also have an abundance of historical evidence for believing that theism is true, which I believe a lot of it to be just as compelling as the scientific evidence, if not more so even. So many people think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith alone. It's not. And I'm going a little bit off piece here. I know I'm supposed to be talking about science, but it's really important, and I do just want to mention it briefly. We have great grounds for believing that Jesus lived, Jesus died, and Jesus rose again. Seen by over 500 after his resurrection, the disciples who claim to have seen him rise from the dead, they traveled the world sharing the news about Jesus. They're all beaten, tortured, killed for what they believed. Nobody in their right mind would take some random made-up lie to their grave and be tortured over it. All they would have had to do is give in and say, "No, sorry, okay, I made it up." And they've all lived, but none of them ever did that. Saul, who murdered and hunted Christians, never even met Jesus, ended up writing the majority of the New Testament. The people who discovered Jesus' tomb to be empty and were the first to see Jesus resurrected were women who were so disregarded back then that their opinion meant nothing. If you were trying to fool people that Jesus rose from the dead, you would not have used women as witnesses. There's so much, and if you do get the chance, I would encourage you to read A Case for Christ, which was the first book I read on it, a story of a devout atheist and law specialist who sets out to disprove Christianity and ends up becoming a Christian. It's quite amazing. Or you can do what I did and buy the DVD instead. I encourage you, do not let science get in the way of your faith. We have plenty of good, solid reasons to believe in God, many of which are scientific. There are a massive amount of astrophysicists that have become Christians because as scientists, they follow the evidence where it leads. Do not think we have a blind faith. We have a reasonable faith based upon evidence. Thank you. We're now going to go. God is good. We're now going to go into a short 10-minute period of Q&A.
First of all, that was amazing. Wasn't that good? I don't know if I've ever heard a 19-year-old give such a polished presentation on such a difficult subject. I mean, that was awesome. Well done. What I love about you is you're not just, as you were saying, growing in your academic head knowledge about your faith and about the relationship between science and faith. You're also actually sharing the gospel, sharing your faith with people in your everyday life with your non-Christian friends. What advice would you maybe give those of us that have non-Christian friends, perhaps at work or wherever it may be, that are atheists, that don't believe in the existence of God, about how we can begin to engage them in conversations about our faith and perhaps respond to questions they may have?
Evangelism can be a very difficult thing. All you have to do is say sometimes just one thing wrong and it can fully put someone off big time. Sharing your faith in a way that others are open to it is a very delicate process. I have found it to be so. And so at the beginning, when I first started sharing the good news, I was purely shared it on an academic basis. I argued good scientific reasons to believe in God. And then what I found was the people I was talking to were too hung up on the science and the physics to have any sort of spiritual opening to Jesus, and that's just not the right way to go about it at all. And when I'm sharing the good news, I spend much less time talking about science. I give reasons to believe that there is no quarrel between science and faith, but you cannot evangelize on science alone. And in terms of evangelizing with people that you see every day, the people that you work with, I think the worst thing you could do is be Bible bashy. If you say to someone, if you don't give your life to Jesus soon, you're going to go to hell, that's definitely not the right approach. You have to approach it very delicately and very slowly. And actually, I think we do some really great events. Men's breakfasts, whatever it may be, a lot of the young adults events. We have a lot of events which are great to bring in non-Christians and just get them involved with the community first. I found that when people come here, like for Easter Alive, we had quite a lot of non-Christians come, and they love speaking with the people. I saw Simon Ponsonby say at Spring Harvest, he says the best kind of apologetics is not actually arguing for the science, the philosophy of God. It's being Jesus' hands and feet and living the Christian lifestyle, and that can make a massive amount of difference because people can see the change in you. People can see that there is something about you, that you have some sort of peace, or something they don't, and I think that's quite visible, and people know that.
Wonderful. Anyone else with any other questions? Go for it. Do you want to shout it out? Maybe I'll repeat it.
Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
The scientific arguments that I have here argue for a God. So monotheistic religions anyway. So it would not do much to defend Hinduism. But certainly for Christianity and Islam, these arguments are relevant. And I think where we distinguish that our faith is the accurate one is through the historical evidence. I think the historical evidence and our knowledge of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is, I want to say, very, very compelling. The historical apologetics of the Christian faith is very good. In terms of these arguments that you have on the handouts, purely defend the existence of a God, a singular monotheistic God.
Wonderful. Well, unless one more question, maybe, Michael, do you want to, for the benefit of our live streamers, I think.
Jacob, I was once asked in a school assembly by a little child, what is God? From what you have seen and thought around the subject, could you possibly attempt to answer the question, what is God?
What is God? Very big question. I believe a philosopher would tell you that God is someone who is omnipotent, that he is maximally powerful, omniscient, that he is all-knowing, and morally perfect. Although it's, on technicalities, impossible for him not to be morally perfect, because without God, morality is just subjective to sociocultural relativism. Morality is pure opinion without God. So with God, with an all-intelligent creator who knows everything and is all-powerful, anything he does would objectively be perfect anyway. But yeah, generally, I believe defined to be as all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. Although that's a very dictionary-like description, and I think those of you here that are Christians know that God's a lot more than just that. He's a personal figure, and I think that's something that's so often dismissed.
Awesome. I think we'll draw stumps there.
I reckon one more. Come on, one more. I think we've got time for one more.
You're keen. You're in full flow here.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's one more question, Steve, use a mic just because we're streaming this.
It's more of a point than anything else. I'm going to stick my neck out here, and people can chop it off if they wish. I do actually take Genesis, particularly chapters 1 to 11, fairly literally. And I think that people do not pay much attention, or indeed any attention, to the actual words. It was Augustine who 1600 years ago pointed out, how can we talk of one 24-hour day before the sun and moon have been created? I worked this out myself and found it in Augustine. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about Genesis, but one point I do want to make is that when I look at this universe, I see it is beautiful, it's magnificent, it's wonderful, all of those sort of things. But my main point is, so it jolly well ought to be, because if this God of ours is all it's cracked up to be, to create a beautiful universe will be a matter of no moment. But I also find that this universe is actually very defective. It actually has a lot of faults. It has a lot of things that are wrong with it. Now, how on earth can a good God create a world like this now? We are told in Genesis, he created the universe, he created the world, and behold, it was very good. Well, yes, it was. But then something happened to cause it not to be so. And I think that the answer actually lies in Genesis chapter 3, if we paid but attention to it. End of rant.
Wonderful round. Thank you, Steve. Good. Okay, Jacob, anything you want to say quickly in response to that before we wrap up?
Anyone, of course, is more than welcome to take Genesis literally. I've good friends of mine that believe all sorts of things theologically that I don't necessarily agree with, and that's okay. And I mean, we're going into the origins of evil, and this is a very long philosophical thing that we don't necessarily have time for today. In terms of the fact that the universe the Earth rather, has a lot of faults, this is true. I mean, a massive amount of the species that have existed are already completely extinct. What is the point of God creating these things if they're never going to live out their lives anyway? But this is a philosophy that really only makes sense if you assume a form of atheism. If you assume absolute theism, that God is true, then he has unlimited time, unlimited resources, and unlimited power, and any allotted time where species may go extinct is redundant to him, especially if he believes in a forever lasting afterlife.
No, I don't buy it. But anyway.
Steve, I am drawing stumps there. Thank you very much for that. That can be a conversation you two continue after this. But thank you very much.
Can I just clarify that I have no quarrel with Genesis, and I have no quarrel with anyone that wants to take it literally. But I like I said, feel welcome to. I don't consider it to be a literal representation of evolution either. I'm a supporter of the fact that it is written as poetry. That's how I take it.
Okay, we're going to stop there. I'm also going to say, thank you, Steve, I know that could go on for some time. I'm also going to say you're all more than welcome in the next few weeks. We're doing a sermon series on an overview of the Bible. So questions of creation, the fall, and how this fits into the bigger story of Scripture will hopefully be answered in church in the coming weeks, so we can continue this conversation as a church in the weeks to come, because I know we've not answered all our questions this morning. Thank you so much for coming. Can we show our appreciation to Jacob one more time? That was a wonderful presentation. Well done for the Q&A as well.